Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jean Morrison. I'm the Provost and Chief Academic Officer at Boston University, and it's really my great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's panel discussion, which is titled Advancing the Global Human Condition, Challenges and Opportunities. Before we begin, I just want to take a moment to recognize Mr. Fred Pardee, both for his extraordinary generosity and for his vision in helping to make thoughtful, truly eye-opening discussions like today's possible. Fred, we're really delighted that you're with us here today. I also want to acknowledge there are a couple of the leaders of Boston University here, President Robert A. Brown and the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Gina Sapiro. It's events like this and the work of the Frederick S. Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future and the forthcoming Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies that highlight the unique role of modern research universities, not only as a home for public policy scholarship, but as a convener of relevant, important conversation that can lead to solutions to some of society's great challenges. We have an exceptional panel of thinkers and experts this afternoon, all of whom are internationally recognized leaders within their field of research. From global public health to economic development, food security, environmental policy, religion, and national defense, all are asking critical questions and producing new knowledge and helping to transform ideas into real-world solutions. They demonstrate the true breadth and depth and real quality of Boston University's faculty. And I'm delighted that they were all willing to agree to come from Boston, which was just whacked by a foot of snow, to Southern California to serve on the panel. Everybody agreed.
What you do for your university.
Well, I can't guarantee that we'll be able to solve all the world's problems this afternoon. It's our hope that this discussion succeeds not only in offering compelling ideas and opportunities for moving forward, but in sparking new conversations and prompting all of us to approach these issues with a widened perspective. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce all of our panelists. And I want to begin with our moderator, Dr. Tony Janetos. Dr. Janetos is the director of the Pardee Center and professor of Earth and Environment in the College of Arts and Sciences. Recognized as one of the world's premier scholars in high-impact global change science and policy, Dr. Janetos has written and spoken widely on the need to understand the scientific, environmental, economic, and policy linkages among the major global environmental issues. Prior to joining BU last year, he'd held numerous high-profile leadership positions at the EPA, at NASA, the University of Maryland, and the Heinz Center for Science, Economics, and the Environment. And Tony will moderate this afternoon's discussion. And now our panelists. Dr. Andy Bacevich is the professor of History and International Relations in the College of Arts and Sciences. A graduate of the U.S. Military Academy and Princeton University, he's among the nation's leading experts on American military history. He recently authored the book titled Breach of Trust: How Americans Failed Their Soldiers and Their Country, and has written numerous books, essays, and editorials tackling America's increasing reliance on militarism to resolve conflict. Adil Najam, professor of International Relations and Earth and Environment in the College of Arts and Science. Adil's a renowned expert in international diplomacy and development. He's written numerous books and more than 100 scholarly articles exploring sustainable development, Muslim and South Asian politics, environmental politics in developing countries, and philanthropy among immigrant communities in the United States. Professor Najam is himself former director of the Pardee Center at BU, and he most recently served as Vice Chancellor of Lahore University of Management Sciences in Pakistan. Dr. Dana Robert is the Truman Collins Professor of World Christianity and History of Mission within the School of Theology. A leading historian and author on world Christianity and its interactions with diverse cultures, Dr. Robert has lectured on 5 continents and overseen more than 60 doctoral dissertations for students, many of whom now hold teaching and ministry positions around the world. In addition to her role as a professor, she serves as director of BU's Center for Global Christianity and Mission, which is a home base for graduate students and visiting researchers in world Christianity. And then finally, Dr. Jonathon Simon is a professor of international health in the School of Public Health. He is the Robert A. Knox Professor and director of BU Center for Global Health and Development, which is a university-wide center tackling health and socioeconomic problems among impoverished populations. Dr. Simon is among the world's leading experts on child survival research, working in developing countries for more than a quarter of a century to strengthen response and prevention efforts for diarrhea, pneumonia, and malaria, particularly among children. He's served in resident positions in Tanzania and Pakistan, and recently served as a global team leader of external evaluators of the President's Malaria Initiative, as well as the Rollback Malaria Partnership. I think you can see that we have an incredibly talented group for our discussion this afternoon, and on that note, I will turn the microphone over to Tony Janetos.
Jean, thank you very much. Before we start, I'd like to thank everybody for the time that you spent getting here, and that you'll spend listening and hopefully interacting with us at the end. At the end of our discussion, we will ask for questions and some interaction with you all. So the way we're going to do this at first is we've asked each of the members of the panel to give a short 4 or 5 minute discussion of some of the major challenges and opportunities for the decades ahead from their own perspective. We've got very different backgrounds and training, and I think you'll see some of that come forward. Following those short statements, we're going to engage in a discussion and do perhaps the most dangerous thing that academics can do, which is thinking out loud without editing. But we're going to give it a try, and I think we'll be happy with the results. And we're going to go in order here. So Andy, would you start?
My pleasure. Well, thank you very much. The trajectory, by the way, is we start by getting you bummed out, and then it's going to become more hopeful. So just don't despair at the outset. Just a few days ago, a friend of mine sent me the following quotation attributed to F. Scott Fitzgerald. The context of the remark was the American penchant for forgetting, or at best for remembering selectively. History, Fitzgerald is said to have remarked, might be a stowaway, but we need the ballast it provides. Now, I am by training a historian, preoccupied with what has already occurred rather than with what is to come. And to the extent that I have a specialty, it's the 20th century, arguably the most horribly violent and destructive era in all of human history. Furthermore, I am by temperament something other than an optimist, an inclination that probably derives from my upbringing in the middle of America in a conservative Catholic family. So when invited to participate in a forum on the challenges and opportunities on improving the human condition, I tend to focus on the challenges. Where others might see possibilities, I see snares and dangers, minefields and obstacles. I am acutely conscious of the hopes for human development to which the 20th century in its time gave rise. Through war, a permanent end to war. Through revolution, the realization of utopia. Through technology, liberation. And I am no less acutely conscious of the mixed results that ensued. From a military historian's perspective, here's the 20th century summarized in a grand total of 7 words: totalitarianism, genocides, collapsing empires, nukes, total war. From that same historian's perspective, based not least of all on the course of events through the first 13 years of this century, Here is what humankind learned from the previous century, reduced to a mere 3 words: not nearly enough. Now that may suggest that historians sharing my disposition don't have much to offer an enterprise such as the Pardee School of Global Studies with its mission of advancing the cause of human development. So is history the skunk at the garden party? I don't think so, and I surely hope not. Of course, there have been hopeful developments coming even from the benighted 20th century, as even historians must acknowledge. Germany and France will almost certainly never fight another war with one another. Europe's penchant for mischief, the cause of so much grief for so many in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, is today vastly diminished. Since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we've had no nuclear weapons used in anger. After the inane Soviet-American arms race of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the total world stock of nuclear weapons is now declining. Fascism, Bolshevism, and Maoism, having together caused the death of countless millions, would each appear to be a spent force, their revival improbable. And if racism, sexism, and anti-Semitism and other forms of prejudice have by no means disappeared from our planet, they have at least fallen into disrepute. Not least of all, and here I speak personally, the practice of dentistry is clearly better than it was back when I had several teeth pulled as a youngster in the 1950s. A never-to-be-forgotten experience, let me tell you. But a better applies not only to dentistry, but also to our present-day ability to collect, measure, design, analyze, erect, manufacture, grow, transport, distribute, replenish, restore, and cure. Science, technology, engineering, and math are riding high. Others in this room have a far better appreciation than I do regarding current trends in higher education, but it seems to me we've entered something like a golden age of STEM, although I might add a second M: science, technology, engineering, math, and management. In that regard, it is simply a fact that student interest in the humanities generally and in history specifically is declining. That's not where the action is. Even so, I'd argue that the practical importance of history, even if as a stowaway, to use Fitzgerald's term, remains undiminished. History does provide, as Fitzgerald emphasized, ballast. It reminds us of our collective propensity for folly. It warns against hubris. It serves as a record of the unintended and unwelcome consequences coming from someone's big idea that was supposed to fix everything. On the plus side, history even offers odd bits of wisdom, almost seldom forgotten or almost forgotten, that may retain surprising relevance for the present. With the founding of the Pardee School on September 1st of this year, the existing BU Department of International Relations will cease to exist. There is no need to mourn its passing. As the Hebrew Bible tells us, there is a time for everything and a season, and the IR department's season is coming to an end. Yet before it disappears, we might reflect briefly on the tradition that it represented. I will refer to it as the Isles tradition, in honor of Herman Isles, who founded the IR program at BU roughly a quarter of a century ago. As was Ambassador Isles himself, the Isles tradition was sober. It was not given to indulging in the fantasy that complex problems will yield to neat and tidy solutions. It was a tradition that emphasized the continuities between past and present. The Isles tradition, in short, was rooted in an appreciation of history. The Pardee School of Global Studies ought to have and will have its own tradition. I expect that tradition will be more forward-looking, more hopeful, and perhaps more ambitious than the one it supersedes. But it is my fondest hope that the Pardee School tradition will nurture a continuing appreciation of the past. Without ballast, a ship may lack stability and is all too likely to founder. So, with that glass half-empty perspective, I surrender the floor to others who may see the glass half full. Thank you.
what I'd like to do is see if I can fill it up halfway. And the way I want to do that is I actually want to ask something of you first. And I actually want you to think, if you can, of where you were and what you were doing on May 23rd, 2007. Because as I look around this room with no 7-year-olds in the house, we were all there. And we all missed something. Where were you in May 2007? Because on that day, the world, for the first time ever, and barring something even more catastrophic than Andy can perceive, became urbanized. First time ever, right? And what I'd like to suggest is that if we are serious about trying to advance the global human condition, we have to overcome the challenges that this demographic transition of historic importance. It has never happened, whether you believe in the Adam and Eve myth or you believe the amphibians walking out of the water. We are now an urban world for the first time ever, and we will become much more urban. So we need to overcome the challenges of urbanization, and we need to seize the opportunities that this historic transformation allows. In 1900, the world was 13% urban. In 1950, it was 29%. As I told you, in 2007, we hit the 50-50 turn point. And by 2050, which is not that far off, some people in this room will be alive at 2050, 2/3 of the world will be urban. We'll have 6 billion people living in urban areas. If you look back to 1970, only New York City and Tokyo. And as I look around this room, I imagine most everybody's been to New York, and a lot of you have probably been in Tokyo. Those were the only 2 megacities on the planet in 1970. Today we have 23 of those. And what's most transformative or important about that is Tokyo's still there, New York and LA are still there. There's 2 megacities in Europe. Remove those 5 from that 23, and I'm always careful about doing public arithmetic, and I see 18 cities in the so-called low-income, or in the old phrase, developing world, that have attained populations of greater than 10 million. But it's not only the megacities, which draw a lot of attention, but it's the unbelievable growth of the cities between 5 million and 10 million, which by most standards are incredibly large cities. We have 59 of them by 2025, and 3/4 of them will be in low-income countries around the world. Stop for a moment and realize that China itself has committed in its current 5-year economic plan to moving 500 million people from the countryside to urban spaces in China. 500 million is more than the population of the United States, United Kingdom, France, and Italy. And China is well on its way to do that. So this historic demographic transformation creates some tremendous opportunities, and I'm going to highlight some of the challenges that I think will be challenges that a great urban research university hopefully will take on through all its units. The Pardee College, the Pardee Center, and the Center for Global Health and Development. The reality is urban areas drive development. It's where ideas come from, it's where technology comes from. It is the transformation from low productivity rural life to higher productivity organization of human labor and the generation of human capital. If you're serious about poverty alleviation, which is one of the great goals in the world, you have to be in favor of urbanization. It is the geographic mobility that actually creates the economic mobility to get people out of poverty around the world. There are economies of scale. Interestingly enough, family size drops. So whereas in previous projections we thought there would be 11 or 12 billion people in the world, no longer so. We're gonna stabilize at about 9 billion. That's largely due to the fact that this dynamic that urban populations have smaller families. So it creates tremendous opportunities to alleviate human suffering through higher incomes, more social organization, at least geographic access to certain social benefits like health care and employment. But there's something else which is part of this. And to me, the transition one is there's some very interesting data which looked at the migration of Tanzanians from rural areas to urban areas in Tanzania. Their consumption went up 36%. People get richer when they move to cities. There's a huge economic gain. But think about what it means for our natural resource base if everybody in the world starts consuming at 1/3 greater level of effort. So this increased consumption puts pressure on our natural resource base. We read all the time about air pollution in China. For those who have been to Mexico City at the wrong time of year, we know that air quality in megacities is a huge problem. We pay less attention to the fact that we have a global water shortage. And getting water to these urban populations is a huge problem. Waste management is huge, and the global warming impacts of having higher consumption populations using greater fossil fuels is a huge and probably the biggest challenge. And I'll cue up Tony to talk a bit about global warming. So increasing, we have opportunities. We know it's the greatest poverty alleviator. But increasing urbanization also heightens what I call the old pathologies and creates the new pathologic risks. We're seeing cholera outbreaks in these urban areas, right? This is back to London and the great cholera pandemics. We're seeing different disease transmission dynamics with TB and HIV. We're seeing increases in violence, particularly domestic violence and violence against women and children, from the pressures and stressors and increased densities of urban space. And what is paradoxical is that our under 5 mortality rate in urban low-income populations is higher than our under 5 mortality rate in rural populations. But there are then new pathologies that emerge from the urban challenge. Changing food consumption and increasing sedentary lifestyles leads to greater obesity and greater levels of diabetes associated with that obesity. Increased air pollution increases asthma, pneumonia, and other respiratory diseases. There are new risks associated, SARS, H5N1, so-called bird flu, and that whole set of emerging diseases that we don't even know about yet because they, by definition, are emerging. And our diagnostic ability to realize that there is a tremendous dynamic of new diseases coming. But then there are things that we often don't think about. When you live in a city, you're more likely to live in a nuclear family. That leads to a loss of child care. It leads to the loss of the extended family being responsible for the child raising burden. And in fact, the impact of that on women's lives, both their labor force participation and also the health of themselves and their child, is profound. So there are social, not only clinical impacts of this increasing urbanization. So if we're going to advance the human condition, and it is inevitable that we will be in cities, we have to seize those opportunities and overcome some of those challenges that I listed. Thank you.
I would suggest that the major challenge and opportunity for advancing the human condition is the problem and the opportunity of what it means to be human in community. We have to talk about what it means to be human in relationship to each other, in our homes, our neighborhoods, our cities, our university, our world. We cannot advance the global human condition unless we reflect on the meaning and values of our community. And our alumnus, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., phrased this issue well when he wrote in 1968. He said, "This is the great new problem of mankind. We have inherited a large house, a great world house in which we have to live together. Black and white, Easterner, Westerner, Gentile and Jew, Catholic and Protestant, Muslim and Hindu, a family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interest, who, because we can never again live apart, must learn to live together. Now, this issue of the meaning of human community has become really urgent in an age of globalization. And I just use my own neighborhood as an example. Okay, I'm a Southerner, married to a Zimbabwean, living in Boston. Next door to me are people from Cape Verde Islands and Romania. On the other side, African Americans, and then next to them, Koreans, and then Brazilians. What is the nature of human community in such a neighborhood? Is it our proximity to each other? Is it our virtual relationship that we keep in touch with the folks back home? My street is a mini United Nations. How do we balance our need to pick and choose, for the individual to pick and choose his or her own identity, with the corporate need we have for abundant life for all, the kind of things that Jonathon has been talking about? Now, this issue of what is human community in a world of globalization has got many components. And I just want to bring up 2 or 3 that are especially interesting to me as a historian of Christianity. First is the opportunity for faith communities to be resources for global civil society in the context of globalization. If you think about the resurgence of faith traditions in the world today, they've outlived all forms of government. You know, our 2,000-year-old, roughly, world religions have outlived autocracy, monarchy, and they're outliving the nation state today. And in an age of globalization, faith traditions are no longer just a matter of localized practices, but they're what historian Abigail Green calls communities of opinion, where people relate to each other around this identity worldwide. Mark Juergensmeyer talks about 3 forms of religious globalization. We've got diaspora, where all of us, people move from one place to another, and he talks about Judaism as an example of this. Some faith communities are transnational, where they move across boundaries in a deliberate way, like Christianity and Islam. Another way that religious communities are globalized is you might call the Gandhi approach. Religious pluralism, cultural, multiple religious belonging in a complex world. So we've got religion as a way of, we need to use this to promote civil society because these faith communities are already boundary crossing. Business and religion, or worldview, are the 2 great global carriers of meaning. And so we need to create common community across boundaries. And so that's the first piece of community building that I'm particularly interested in. Second, as Dr. King's world house metaphor illustrates, we need to talk about values and ethics. What are our values around human community? How can we make the tough decisions that our panelists are talking about in the future if we don't even discuss what our common values are? I would dare say we all believe in abundant life for all. That's a shared value. We believe in North America, we believe in pluralism and democracy as a value. But do those values mean we have to strip ourselves of our particular identity to flourish? I don't think so. The need to study values and ethics is something we can do in the Pardee school in terms of taking a global approach at what it means to be a human community of interconnected individuals in a global context. Then the third issue I think that I want to bring up within community building is the one that Andy brought up, the need to recover history. But I'd put it a little differently, and here I want to quote Robert Pinsky. He said, "A people is defined and unified not by blood, but by shared memory." And if we are united according to our shared memory, we have to ask, as postmodern Northern Hemisphere people, what are we going to have as our shared memory, our shared identities going forward? We've got to have some discussion and interaction about this. I mean, I don't know about you, but I can hardly talk to my mother because she watches Fox News and I watch CNN. With those kind of divisions, how do we move forward as a community? So we have a problem of a common narrative needed in times of change. During the Second World War, historians in the American Historical Association couldn't meet because of Pearl Harbor. So their 1942 meeting was called The Quest for Political Unity in World History. What I'm saying is I think with globalization and in the 21st century, we've come to another one of those moments in time where we need to be reflecting on not just our differences, but what will we do together as human beings in community, beyond politics and economics, and move into the areas of culture and values.
I don't think there's anything left to say after that tour de force. But let that not stop me from saying it. Two men looked out of the prison bars. One saw mud, the other saw stars. I'm a stargazer. We are in the city of angels, and I think there are stars in the sky. And I think the aspiration for our generation, the aspiration for the students that will come to the Pardee school is to become stargazers. I think the aspiration for them is to reach out to those stars, to do better than has been done, to do better than we think could be done. I will plagiarize, but I will plagiarize from a wonderful person, my colleague Andy Bacevich, and I'll just take his framework. When I look at my rear view mirror, you know, when I was at the Pardee Center, we used to say that I would never drive a car without a clean windscreen, but I would also never drive a car without a rear view mirror. History is important. It's just that my rear view mirror shows me something else. When I look at my rear view mirror, I also see 7 things. My 7 things are different. Freedom, democracy, prosperity, longevity, connectivity, education, human rights. That's the story of the last century. The world is a freer place today than it has ever been. You cannot actually say that man is born in chains and is born free and forever in chains. That is no longer empirically true. Because we went through the hurt and the pain and the blood and the gore that you talked about, we as a learning species learned. We are a more democratic world than we have ever been. This year, 2014, 68 countries will have elections. 68 countries this one year will go to election. They will not be perfect. They will not be perfect. But that's more than we could have imagined in the last century. Prosperity. We are a richer planet today than we have ever been. The shame is not that we are not rich. The shame is that we still have poor amongst us and do not have it in our heart to reach out to them and make the world a better and more equal place. Longevity. We live longer, we live better. The problems that we have is because we live longer and we live better. If obesity is the big problem, thank God for that. Because imagine the alternative, and I can speak from experience. Connectivity. And this is not just the iPhone. We are a more connected planet. We are a more connected species than we could have ever imagined to be. My grandmother uses Skype. No education, but she can actually use it better than me because she wants to talk to her great-grandchildren. So connectivity, and it's not just Skype. It's mobility, it's travel, it's television, it's Fox News. My grandmother also watches Fox News, but just because she wants to get angry. Education. We are a more educated people today than we have ever been in human history, and again I won't. Human rights. The reason we get so worked up today is not because human rights are being denied to the many, but because we've raised the bar so high all over the world. I come from Pakistan. This is not just an American story. All over the world, we have raised the bar to what we will tolerate so high that we shall not tolerate that which was the norm. We shall not tolerate slavery. We shall not tolerate gender discrimination. We shall not tolerate all sorts of things which were the norm that people in this room grew up with. So we are better there. My point here is not that everything is hunky-dory, because if it were, we would all be out of a job. We make a living out of finding problems. And I can promise you there shall be no dearth of problems in the future. My point is that our great challenges today come from the great opportunities that we as a species have created. In some ways, I'm reminded of that wonderful scene from Marlon Brando in On the Waterfront. Anyone remember that scene? He's back of the cab, and there is this great line, "We could have been a contender." That's the challenge of our century. We could have been a contender. We are the people. That is why we have no place to hide. Our parents did. We do not. We have enough food today to feed 10 billion people, yet they go hungry. That's our shame. We have enough wealth today to remove abject poverty in this country and in the world tomorrow. We even have people who are willing to help with that. We have not found the way to do that. Our challenges are the challenges of aspiration. Our challenges is reaching those stars that I talked about. Let me end with actually what I had prepared. This part I hadn't. My challenges, response to the original question, is 4 things. What are the great challenges? And embedded in them are the great opportunities. The 4 challenges are identity, arrogance, organization, and security. Identity, because we have organized ourselves throughout history by our differences. My tribe is separate from your tribe. My geography is separate from your geography. My religion is separate from your religion. My race is separate from your race. Can we rise to a place where humanity can be that organizing principle? It's not easy. Ain't there yet. Ain't there yet. But that identity, whether it comes in the community that Dana talks about, whether it comes in the humanity that human development talks about, that's one of the great challenges. Can we create the global citizenship that does not rob me from being a Pakistani, from being a Muslim, from being a Bostonian, from being a cricket lover, and yet allows me to have a connection with those who are not any of those things? That's, I think, challenge number 1. Challenge number 2 is arrogance. This is what Tony and I work on a lot. You work on arrogance too? Climate change. The arrogance of the human species in its moment of great achievement is to forget the limits of our surroundings. To forget that ultimately we are one species that is dependent on this great web of life. That is the challenge of natural resource. That is the challenge of environment. That is the challenge of water. That is the challenge of arrogance versus wisdom. I think we as a species have the wisdom to solve these problems. I'm not sure if our arrogance can be checked in this sense that we can always conquer more. Organization, global governance. And that is not management. But I think governance is the central defining challenge of the next century. It is not simply what institution, where, and who manages what. It is organizing for a planet. We do not know that. We haven't been good at that. We haven't even been very good at organizing for a nation. But organizing, governing for a planetary world, for a global world, that's the great challenge. That is happening in economy, that is happening in environment, that is happening everywhere. Finally, security, and I'll end with this, the redefinition of security. Security was of the sovereign. That's why IR people worry so much about sovereignty and security. There was a guy, nearly always a guy, and he had sovereignty. That was his world. And that is what the entire enterprise was meant to save. If we have moved to this democratic world, then the security is not just of the sovereign, but of the human being. In 2002, when I learned with this, I did a book on human security in South Asia. And one of my favorite numbers out of that, back of the envelope calculation, this is not politics. So this is Pakistani speaking, but this is not politics. At that point, 55 years of constant conflict between India and Pakistan. 55 years of constant war between India and Pakistan. In 55 years of war, total number of Indians killed by the Pakistani side. 55 years, total number of Indians killed by the Pakistani side is less than the number of children only who will die in 1 year only because of dirty water only in New Delhi only. The exact same number was true on the Pakistan side for Karachi. Here is my problem as an IR person, as a policy person. Having taught this thing for 20 years, I have no idea. Here's the point. If you are the child who is dead, if you're the mother of the child who is dead, your child is no less dead whether he dies at the wrong end of a gun or the wrong end of a tap. Here's my problem as a policy person. I have no idea what to do about the gun. I know exactly what to do about the tap. $18.83. $18.83 is the cost of saving one life lost to dirty water. That, I think, is the challenge. That, I think, is the opportunity for the Pardee School, for future generations, for all of us. Thank you.
Adil, thank you. Originally, when we put this panel together, I thought I was going to be so smart to go last, and now I'm wondering about the wisdom of that. I want to take a little bit of a different tack, and as Andy did, talk a little bit about in one sense, sort of how I was trained. I was trained as an ecologist, as a natural scientist. The study of the way that living things on this planet interact both with each other and with their physical environment. And like a lot of young PhDs, I thought I was sort of firmly on the path to a life of academic study and theoretical study of the way that the physical and natural world works. But sometime after finishing my graduate training, it became really clear that you can't understand the way the world actually is unless you understand the demands that we as people and societies put on it. That we are an intrinsic part of that interaction between the natural world and the physical world. Our societies, our economic demands, our demands for basic resources, for food, for water, for energy, are now at the stage, one of the consequences of the growth and development that we've seen in the 20th century, are at the stage where we are big enough to matter to the whole world and not just to our immediate neighborhood. This is a challenge that I think the scale of which we still barely recognize. But we've had enormous impacts over these past, let's just say, past 100, 150 years. The world now has roughly half the amount of forest that it did prior to mechanized agriculture. Most of that forested land has been, in fact, devoted to the production, to agricultural production. Europe went through that transition very, very early in its history. But in the Americas, in Southeast Asia, in Central Africa, that transition is still going on. And in the later part of the 20th century, there was almost a one-to-one swap in the tropics and subtropics of forested land for agricultural production. Simply the ability to measure that is in fact one of the technological achievements of environmental science of the late 20th century. But understanding its consequences still bedevils us today. Energy use. We have raised by orders of magnitude the amount of energy that we are able to provide literally around the world. It is the keystone of economic development in the industrialized West. It is the keystone of economic development, such as we understand it in poorer parts of the world, but we have massive parts of the world that are essentially in energy poverty and that will not develop in the way that they aspire to and the way that we might hope that they can attain unless we can do something about continuing to produce energy in a way that does not involve trashing the rest of the planet. Greenhouse gases. So I wasn't sure where Adil was going with his statement that we both work on arrogance, but on reflection, I think it's right. I no longer talk about the length of time that I've spent studying climate change and climate change impacts and how we adapt or how we might mitigate and reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. I only think about it in terms of the extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So I've been at this for about 35 parts per million. I won't tell you how many years that is because that's the depressing part. But we have already changed the physical climate of the Earth. This is not a matter of debate. No serious scientist debates this. And we are dealing with the impacts as we speak. I took a drive yesterday. I really enjoyed my snow day in Santa Monica, I have to tell you. Thank you for that. And my wife and I went up into the canyons and drove along the ridge tops before coming back down by the beach. And the one overwhelming feature of the landscape that stood out to everybody is how dry it is. Everything's brown. It should be green this time of year. Now, we're inundated by what, 1/8 of an inch of rain? It's not enough. And this is exactly the kind of consequence that we have to get smart about, because this is simply a taste for the environmental future of many of us. I hope I don't have to come back in June. I dread what this fire season will hold. The U.S. Has seen historically large fire seasons. And it might surprise you to learn that even in the U.S. federal government, there is not an uncountable number of billions of dollars to deal with fire and its consequences, nor is there a plan B. And this is one of the institutional challenges of these kinds of environmental consequences that we've built for ourselves. But for each of these adverse environmental consequences, the challenge is that we can also point to undeniable social and human benefits. We feed unprecedentedly large numbers of people around the world. We don't feed them all, and that is, as Adil said, to our shame. But we have enough calories and enough nutrients to feed every person on Earth, easily. And we feed more people now than ever before in human history. We have provided energy that spurs economic development that was almost unimaginable before the Second World War. There are parts of the world, Africa being one, where we've actually halved the number of people in abject poverty. There are still too many in abject poverty. But for each of these, so for each of these large environmental consequences about which we think correctly that we need to do something about, there are benefits on the other side of that equation. We might usefully ask ourselves why the institutions that we've built for ourselves and the governance that we've built for ourselves is more effective at managing local, regional, or even national environmental and energy issues than it is at managing these global issues. The Cuyahoga River no longer catches fire. Air quality in this country, air quality in Western Europe, is enormously better, even in the megacities, than it was in 1960. In the space of just a few decades, 50 years. The institutions that we've built since the Second World War, that we've put to the service of trying to manage these larger global issues, on the other hand, struggle. They're ineffective, they're slow, they congratulate themselves on process without being clear about actual progress. And so, from my perspective, one of the biggest challenges and opportunities that we face globally, that universities like BU will face, is how we're actually going to sustain a world of 9 billion people, most of whom will live in cities, most of whom will live in what we now think of as the developing world, without compromising the welfare of the next 9 billion people. Where's the energy going to come from? Where's the water going to come from? Where's the food going to come from? Do we have ways of equitably distributing those kinds of resources without compromising our principles? This is not just a problem for the physical and natural sciences, although it certainly is a problem for the physical and natural sciences, but it's equally a problem for institution building, for governance, for economics, and for culture that we need to tackle or simply face the consequences. Thank you. Okay, so what I'd like to do with the panelists is maybe try to ask some questions that will spur a little bit of discussion. And so let me just try to get the ball rolling here. We've all talked about the challenge, the sort of the simultaneous challenges of living in a globalized world, economically, institutionally, culturally, and a concern for how we might make this transition to a world that is, in some ways, increasingly disparate and at odds with one another, but in other ways, intrinsically globalized. Do we have the institutions that can actually do that? Or how can we think about developing them? So Adil, let me ask you first to respond.
Do we have the institutions? No. Do we have the realization that the institutions we have are no longer fulfilling that mandate? Yes. Our institutions were designed for a different, global institutions were designed for a different time, a different challenge. Essentially the international system, no, the global system, which is the UN. The international system is Westphalia and well before that, but the UN proper was designed to prevent a third world war. It's done fairly well in that. It wasn't designed for the challenges of global citizenship. It wasn't designed for the challenges of connectivity. And those institutions, I think, are struggling to emerge. And that's you know, the example I use sometimes in my classes, my kids had this bad habit, I hope yours didn't, that, you know, every year they would grow. And they would grow out of their clothes, and you would tell them not to do that. Right? But they wouldn't listen. And the global system, I think, has done the same thing. It's kept growing, and our institutions are still sort of in that freeze frame of an earlier era. And climate is a very good example, because the normal ways of how we do institutions just doesn't fit climate. You know, as a Pakistani citizen, passport holder, if I go to Canada, I need a visa. When pollution from my car goes to Canada, carbon molecule doesn't have a little flag on it, needs no visa, right? And that's the challenge, and I think that's a good challenge to have, because at this moment, the economic institutions are probably doing better, because the reality of economic exchange is forcing those institutions to confront the challenge. Institutions in a lot of other areas are doing much worse, that's my sense.
John.
Our institutional structure to meet our challenges is frankly woeful. And to me, I think there are two pieces to that. One, the most interesting problems that we confront are fundamentally transdisciplinary. But we have WHO working on health. We have UN, development program. We have the environment program. We have Food and Agricultural Organization. And we are, in the same way that universities struggle with their disciplinary structure, our global architecture is within sectors or disciplines, whereas the action is trans-sector and trans-discipline. So we're fundamentally mismatched. Even if our clothes grew, we wouldn't fit them, or they would still be homely. But the other thing, I think, is that we have no mechanism to sunset our institutions. They
never die.
It's incredible. It is pretty obvious that the WHO needs radical transformation. And everybody agrees on that. So you say, okay, let's close it and start over. Let's zero budget it. No, we can't go. No. And I don't think there's any of our global architecture that wants to be the first one to step forward and say, all right, we outgrew our clothes. So I think both the fact that we're disciplinary structured and that we have no sunset mechanisms hurts us dramatically.
Well, who is we? The we you guys refer to. My sense would be that we, as individuals, inhabit a world in which over time has come to be a radically disproportionate distribution of privileges. And to oversimplify the case, we in the West and we in the United States certainly are among the more privileged. And if the challenge is that the global we should share more equitably, both in resources and also in the sacrifice and pain, how are you going to persuade the privileged we to buy into that? And this kind of gets to the democracy point. It is a good thing that there will be, whatever you said, Adil, 69 nations that have elections this year. I'm not entirely persuaded that having an election equals having a democracy. It's good that there are fewer autocracies, but it doesn't follow, it seems to me, that going through the process necessarily equals genuinely popular rule or governance that reflects the will of the people. But I would say this, if the global we says, let's have an election in which we're going to decide how to redistribute goods, the Western we isn't necessarily going to buy into that. So what is where are the genuinely democratic institutions? I certainly don't believe that the United Nations is a genuinely democratic institution. That would help achieve the larger purposes that I hear you all referring to.
Dana.
Well, is the real question institutions? Institutions always fail eventually, but the human spirit keeps going. If you look back at the challenges of previous generations, there was great despair, and the human spirit and creativity, if given conditions in which it can flourish, throws over those institutions and founds new ones, moves forward. That's why I think we should have endless faith in our young people who actually are born into a world that has changed considerably from when us middle-aged folks were kids, and the realities that they face, and they're interconnecting with each other, is moving in a way that we can't even imagine when we're middle-aged. So I think the connectivities among institutions, the institutions will rise and fall depending on the human relationships. And I think the generation today has a hunger for relationships with people not like themselves. Now that's something that's fundamentally different than maybe previous generations.
I sympathize with the sentiment, but I think it's wrong. And I think it's wrong because the idealistic people that we teach, and I think there's no question that they possess these ideals, once they leave Boston University, some very considerable percentage of them basically have to submit to the imperatives of the market. And the imperatives of the market are not conducive to the sort of idealism that you refer to. I wish that were not the case. I mean, the market is more powerful than any international institution. The market is, alas, I think, more powerful than the human spirit, and the market is not necessarily conducive to solving some of the problems that I think you'd like to solve.
Can I jump in? I'm not, actually much of what you said I agree with, including that election is not democracy. But the market is not necessarily bad.
No, it's not.
Institution is not organization. Now, that mistake one should never do. Our organizations have failed much more than our institutions, because institutions, like faith maybe, are generic. And I think the lens of looking only at countries has begun to crumble. For 20 years, I worked in Boston University. I worked in the first world part of Boston. 3 miles from where I and you work is the third world part of Boston, Roxbury. Then I went to Pakistan, and I worked in the first world part of Pakistan. And 3 miles from where I worked was the third world part of Pakistan called Bhatta Chowk. So I think when we talk about we and us and them and redistribution, that too is changing, and globalization is changing it. You're right, redistribution is not going to happen by election. Redistribution may not even be a good thing. But rebalancing is. Look at what has happened after the financial crisis. There was fiscal policy here in the US, which pumped a lot of capital, because interest rates went down here, into emerging markets. Emerging markets went up. Now we are tapering, emerging markets are coming down. Emerging markets give us factory to the US Walmart. So what I'm getting at is that those dynamics that we try to contain very neatly within these boundaries no longer work. Not only those economic dynamics, disease dynamics. Disease travels, the dengue, which I'm very, very interested in for various reasons, travels much faster than I do. The mosquito is smarter than man, it turns out. And so for all those reasons, there are these global forces that we need to confront, understand, which will shape the world as they did earlier. And that's the change I think that needs to happen.
One of the challenges that I think that's been sort of explicit in this discussion is this sort of relative strengths of institutions and organizations, of the sort of cultural richness which we experience in a completely different way now, and certainly our children experience in a completely different way than even we did, and this notion of the, in a sense, a sort of omnipotence of the market. But I think it's important to understand the market is not something that is, or markets are not something that have descended on us from on high. They are human creations. And even in this country, we can change the market if we choose to do so. There was no market force in the 1960s after the publication of Silent Spring that said, you need to do something about this. It is not right to poison the atmosphere and cause children and elderly people to get asthma and die prematurely. That is just not acceptable in a civilized society. And we don't do that. We don't do that now. Carbon, we haven't figured out, but we really don't do that, and other countries don't do that. There's undeniable progress in that respect because we chose differently. Value systems do change over time. And so I think that we have to, my sense, and maybe this is why I'm on this end of the dais from Andy, is that we have no choice but to be optimistic. We may fail, and we certainly won't succeed in every endeavor. But if we don't proceed from the notion that these are challenges for which we can begin to at least devise a way that's better than muddling through, it's hard to see where else the progress will come from. And so this raises a question to me of how do we begin to address these kinds of challenging issues in the context of a major research university. Right? It's one thing to talk about the challenges that face us over the coming decades and discuss about potential solutions or not, but we also now have this responsibility to, every year, to this group of 17 to 21-year-olds who are coming to BU and places like BU. And so how do we prepare them for this kind of a new world that we perceive? Thoughts?
Well, if in a sense Adil and I are in two quite different camps in our sense of where international relations lies and where it ought to go, then it seems to me one of the things that a research university like ours should do, the Pardee School should do more specifically, is to confront the difference and to wrestle it to the ground and see if there's any way to reconcile the differences. And here, let me give you an example. If indeed the approach to international relations that emphasizes a system of sovereign states with success defined simply as avoiding war, not achieving peace and justice, but avoiding war. If the system that I think you would like us to move to would have more ambitious goals in that regard. You know, to my mind, we need to confront the fact that all these crazy people who want to engage in humanitarian intervention because it's going to, you know, save lives. I'm not saying that's where you are.
I would like to save lives.
The track record does not necessarily suggest that they achieved the aims they set out to. On the contrary, to my reading of the track record would be that, guess what? They make things worse more often than not at very, very, very considerable costs. Now, taken to extreme, that becomes a recipe for inaction, and I would not want to take it to that extreme. But if indeed we're moving to a new world in which the concerns of the global we will take precedence, then I think we need to evaluate this record of intervention for purposes beyond simply the traditional purposes of international security, meaning trying to avoid catastrophe.
If I can,
Andy, well, maybe if I can jump in. 1986, I moved to Boston. In that year, 17.5 million children died before their 5th birthday. Our best estimate in 2013 is about 7 million children will die before their 5th birthday. I actually see progress in that. We made a commitment as a globe, and the we is, I think, truly a global we, to tackle malaria again. We haven't figured out how to tackle dengue, but we're going to tackle malaria again. And in a short 8 years, we've gone from 1.2 million deaths to about 600,000 deaths. Are those 7 million children who die before 5, or those 600,000 who still die of malaria tragedies? Absolutely, for each individual family. But that has to be seen as human progress. And in fact, that has been the mobilization of scientific insight and community action to make those gains. So, you know, I'm a realist and I'm an empiricist, and I think about those 10 million kids, and I think about those 600,000 kids. And that helps me get up in the morning and bang my head against the wall of doing global health. And I hope to tie it to what we need to be doing is I hope I can inculcate in the students of Boston University a passion to continue to do that, but not a naive passion. Tony, we have a lot of students who are not 17 to 21. We have 10,000 students that are post-baccalaureate, so it's a little reminder that our university is larger and more complex than our important undergraduates. And in fact, I think we need to, one, inculcate values. It doesn't bother me that they're naive idealists at 17, and I got some at 28 in my master's program, because the alternative may be worse. I think we need to work on values. I think they need to understand that that complexity requires them to understand that disciplinary training is not the appropriate way to actually solve problems and engage with the world. And that's very difficult to do in the structure of universities. But the more that we can do to make sure that they're grounded in history, but have a very good analytic toolkit, or whatever their thing is, but the cross-disciplinary stuff. Because to me, it's all about training the next generation to deal with the absolute complexity that our hubris has allowed us to think we can solve.
So part of that complexity, it seems to me, is also having the discipline to study problems the way they present themselves,
Yeah.
as opposed to decomposing problems artificially into boxes and disciplines and sectors simply because that was the way we were trained. Somebody asked me in a meeting the other day, what's your disciplinary background? By which I think they meant as a shortcut for which department do you live in. And my response was both glib and but true, and it's that I no longer feel like I have a particular discipline. I don't feel constrained to try to understand problems simply through the lens of being an ecologist or an environmental scientist or even a physical scientist. I want to understand problems the way they actually are. And if we're smart, then help to define solutions or devise potential solutions that can actually be implemented. And so, and we have, as you say, many examples. How many people would know, for example, that the US has more forested land now than it did in 1960?
Yep.
So I would love to be able to go to Sao Paulo in 20 years and have that same thing be true. And, do we know enough to actually do that?
If I can add something, first of all, rule number 1 in life, never be in a different camp from Andy Bacevich. And I shall not break that rule. War is in no danger of going out of fashion. States shall not wither. Not in our lifetimes, not in any near term, and I'm not sure if it will be a good thing if they ever did, because they serve very useful purposes. So it's not a different direction as much as a more expanded tent. As much, it's not saying international relations has changed, it is saying international relations has expanded. All that has been true remains true. More dimensions have been added. Every time we board a plane, more dimensions are added. It is not the global we, it is the global me that I'm concerned about. There is no global we, and we will keep creating those divisions to organize ourselves. We will create flags and fortresses, and that's how we are as a species. That's how we've organized it. It's worked fairly well through the species history. But it's the global me. I think the student that is coming to Boston University is a global citizen, and we haven't figured out how you cultivate that global citizen. That global citizenship doesn't mean that your national citizenship or your bowling league or something else withers away. It is this thing of having multiple identities. My firstborn son was born in Brigham in Boston. His name is Musa, M-U-S, Moses in Arabic. And when we were writing the name in the birth certificate, the doctor started laughing. And he said, "You aren't taking any chances." So I didn't understand what he was saying. And then he said, "It's M-U-S-A." Right? And he was born the 4th of July. Right? So yes, we weren't taking any chances. But there is a whole generation of Musas out there, and they're not just in the US. They are citizens of a planet where they are rooted in their present, but between Facebook and between television and between the movies they see and the music that they see, Justin Bieber is followed in Pakistan. It's a pity.
I was going to say, that's not encouraging.
It's a pity.
You say that like it's a good thing.
No, it isn't. But that's the world that these kids have to be prepared for. Their diseases travel, their cultural influences travel, their economy travels, and therefore those things have to be brought in into the discourse. And I think that's a very exciting challenge of training a new generation of scholars and practitioners. One very, very short thing. When the Fletcher School, where I taught for a little while, you know, I got wavered and left BU for a little while, but I've come back. When they were started, more than 50% of their students went to the diplomatic service. In the 70s, more than 50% of their students came from the military. Now, nearly 80% of their students get employment either in the business sector or in the nonprofit sector. The business sector is the single largest employer of international expertise today, because business as an institution has taken on. I don't know where Microsoft is. I don't know where Google is, because that's the reality these kids will inherit. That's the reality we need to train them for.
Adil, how old is Musa?
Now he's 16, sorry.
Too young, because my Aisha, born in Karachi, right? I got an Aisha born in Karachi. You got a Musa born at Brigham. You know, that's.
I've got a Samuel born in Boston. So there we go.
So,
I think we have a tremendous opportunity at BU to train global citizens. I mean, I think that's what we already do. We can do better, and the Pardee School will help us do a better job with that. I think we ought to connect our self-consciousness about being a global university with our one BU idea and move that into some intellectual content. So we all know we need our disciplines and fields, and we need to turn out people who are qualified to do things in life, to get jobs and so on. But what if we use one BU and the Pardee School to say, let's talk about poverty and have a discussion across all the different disciplines from all different directions as a global issue, poverty, that we reflect on from all our different directions across the university. So I think we're training global citizens, and I don't think that is necessarily against the market of human individual choice. I mean, at some level, the market is about human individual choice. Frederick Buechner said that vocation is a matter of connecting your deepest need with the world's deep need. Now, university is a great place to do that. As people are becoming who they are, they say, what is your deep need? Who are you really? And how does that connect with what the world needs? Now, if students can have that aha moment when they're at Boston University, and many of them do, then I think we're doing a good job. And I'd like to see us just really be self-conscious about making those kind of connections between the person and the world.